just want to take some time and introduce our excellent panel that we have with us today. And so we have 6 panelists, and I'm just going to introduce them by their name and title. And when they come on to speak, they want to say more about themselves, they can. So we have Derry Moten, the Manager of Employee and Organizational Development at EBMUD. Sonja Stanchina, who's the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Contra Costa Water. And then we have Linda Nguyen, who's a Management Analyst in the Racial Equity and Inclusion at Valley Water. And we have Ryan Pedrotti, who's the Principal Program Specialist. And there may be something different about his title. We can clear that up later. He works at Sonoma Water. And then we have Masood Ordikhani. He is the Chief Equity and Innovation Officer at SFPUC. And we have Stephanie Orosco, who's the Vice President of HR at San Jose Water. Just to give you a little bit about what's going to happen today, I did the welcome and introductions. Derry Moten and other panelists, if they chose to speak, will talk about what is equity. And then we'll talk about some stories of race and equity. I'll share some of my experience with that. And Sonja Stanchina will talk about some data statistics on racial equity. And then we'll address the question, how does racial equity impact environmental justice? And then we'll talk about what some agencies are doing to address racial equity. Then we'll have Q&A and some closing comments at the end. So now I want to turn it over to Derry Moten to share with us what he would like to share.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Derry Moten, as Robert said, with the East Bay Municipal Utility District, East Bay MUD. We are organizationally, I'm going to provide you kind of a backdrop on kind of what we're working on in this arena, which will help frame the definition of thinking about what equity actually means. So in 2019, our board of directors required us to begin thinking about how we would address creating a strategic plan for diversity and inclusion, specifically to ensure that our efforts around diversity and inclusion were parallel, and we were giving as much attention to diversity and inclusion as we've been given to other areas of our organization where we had different master plans, as I'm sure all of our organizations do. What we have been doing is we have been working specifically in the space of looking at diversity and inclusion from an EEO and an affirmative action lens. And so we've been looking at how do we continue to address the issues that arose in terms of harassment or other things that would happen in the organization when people would have difficulties where we saw maybe some race motivated issues may occur on a situational basis. We had been regularly doing our affirmative action reports in terms of identifying where we had underutilization of different ethnicities or gender in some of our job families. We were doing all the traditional things that historically, organizationally, we have done in our groups. But what our board asked us to do was to take a closer look at how we were addressing not only those issues, but what were we doing in terms of making sure that we had adequately addressed not only the specific issues as they arose, but looking further out and looking at how can we put more mitigating factors. We have a again, workforce development program that we have, which has again internships where we again targeting identifying opportunities for both underprivileged or underrepresented young people in the organization. So again, we were doing some of the basic things. But what we're asked to then reflect on was to look deeper and think about not just the fact that we had challenges with recruiting or we had challenges with other things, but what were the factors around us that actually required us organizationally that were maybe blocking us from making progress, is probably a better way of putting it. One of the things that we then started having a conversation with our board was about the issues of gentrification in our service area. what the impact of that was, and we determined that we would hire a contractor to help us work on building a diversity inclusion long-term plan or strategic plan. So as we've gotten into the process of dealing with this, the issue of equity has come up in terms of looking at equity from the lens of internal equity, in terms of, as we're doing recruitment and looking at other specific traditionally related things to EEO and affirmative action. But it has also made us look at the issue of inequities beyond our internal, and looking at, are there inequities in how we're providing services? And our immediate thing is, for most of us, is considering water quality. And for most of us, our water quality doesn't change from neighborhood to neighborhood. However, there are maybe other things that are inequitable in how we actually are delivering services. And so that question has been the kind of the question that our board has asked us to look at. And so we're in the process right now of both doing internal and external scans with considering how we're actually addressing these things. And do we have challenges that we're not aware of? And that brings us to thinking about the definition of equity. And there's a great video that I'm going to drop a link to. I'm not going to try to play it here because it's a little longer than we would have time to really address. But there is a video by a woman by the name of Dr. Camara Jones. And Dr. Jones, in this particular video, and I'm having a problem posting, I'll get to that in just a second. But in this video, she gives an allegory which is called the gardener's tale. And some of you may or may not have seen this video. But in the tale, she talks about how she had to come to grips and think about the issue of racism when her and her husband moved into a new home, and there were two planter boxes in this new house that they moved into, and one was filled with soil already, the other one was empty. And so what they did was they went in and they began to actually get seeds that they wanted to put in front of their new home. They filled the box that was empty with new potting soil. They planted equal seeds in both boxes. And after several weeks, what they began to notice was the box in which they had put the new fertile soil, the flowers sprang up and looked great. The seeds they had put in the secondary box were struggling. They weren't coming up properly. They weren't coming up with the same strength, even though they had come from the same batch of seeds. And so what she began to equate this to was the issues of then thinking about systemic racism from the vantage point of these two planter boxes. And so what she kind of dipped into is that she dipped into the issue of thinking about the fact that inequities, especially here in the United States, kind of stem from a couple of different places, which have really in ways, and this is my paraphrase of what she said, in ways placed people into a planter box where the soil conditions are not equal to other conditions. And those that were placed in the better box, the box with the new soil, with the other things, those began to excel and began to kind of move forward. And even the weaker seeds still began to kind of come up to at least a middle level. Where the box, where they then began doing more exploration as to what was in the box, and they realized the box had been filled with rocks and there were other challenges in the soil. And so on the surface, while everything looked equal, there were inequities in the boxes. And that no matter how many times, year after year, the seeds would harvest and go to plant, as more seeds were birthed back into the same circumstances, that there began to be an inequity in, number one, the boxes, the seeds that were placed in the good box, not doing anything negative to the other ones in the other box, but the others in the box where there was challenge, or rocks where there was more challenge, that these particular flowers did not bloom. And so when we fast forward and we look to where we are now, we come out of the allegory into our own issue. The big question we want to think about is, are there inherent inequities in our communities or in our systems in which the inequities continue to perpetuate themselves without anyone having to be, quote, racist? But do the systems themselves are there inherent problems in areas in which we have not identified or uncovered because they are issues below the surface? And while all things appear to be equal, they are actually, in fact, not equal. So when we think about dealing with equity, when it comes to hiring, we're trying to hire local individuals. We're trying to hire individuals from certain communities, and there's not equity in the school systems. And there's not equity in how these individuals have had access to either to healthcare or to other factors. We work in the water industry and we might say, well, that's not our problem. Well, it is if we participate in a community. And so when we see that there are inequities, those inequities perpetuate themselves into things that then, in case where we're trying to make hires, we may not have recognized that we maybe aren't finding the diversity of hires that we're looking for because we have maybe not looked at how we as partners in the community are either adding to or not adding to some of the inequities in our local school systems or other things that we may be able to assist. Our local STEM programs or other ways that we, as an organization filled with scientists and engineers and people who work in technical capacities, could really maybe making better investments into those arenas. Whereas there are other communities within our same service areas who then don't have the same issues. And so it gets into that on the hiring side. And what do the inequities on our service side look like? Well, we discovered as we've been having conversation that we have a tendency in our organization, and I'm being very transparent with us. And again, is it intentional? I don't think it's intentional, but it's a matter of systemic problems. And that is when we have people who call our board of directors or we have people who call their elected officials, what do? We respond to them. We respond to them because of political issues, and that's just a reality. Well, who are the individuals who are most likely to call? Those political officials. Most likely people who have the deepest connection to those individuals, so people who are more exposed. And so we've been looking at some of our own patterns, and we talked about this with some of our staff who are working in some of our maintenance areas. We've come to realize that some of our tendency is when we have customers in some of our more affluent areas who are more likely to attend public meetings and become vocal, more likely to participate in some of the political process, that there is a correlation between them and the racial makeup of the service of those particular service areas. And so the question we had to face, and we are still facing, is how do we level that playing field so that if in cases where in certain parts of our service area where there are lower income people, that there are clusters of different races or ethnicities in certain areas that do not as frequently participate in the political process. If we have a public meeting and nobody shows up, do we just say, great, we just do what we want to do? Do what we've intended? Or do we actually start thinking about who we're actually serving and use the concept of equity to change our approaches to make sure that we're actually reaching out to people properly? So we have a working definition of equity that I'm going to give you, and then I'm going to sign off and let everyone else kind of jump in because we have some great people that are going to share some information. But this working definition that we're starting to provide is that equity occurs when a person or a group's identity or diversity characteristics cannot determine or predict an outcome. And so when we get to the point where the nature of a neighborhood or the nature of who's applying no longer plays, then we will have found equity. But until we can safely say that, that's one of the things that we want to focus on is how do we continue to structure ourselves and address issues as we identify them to make sure that we're actually promoting equity. So I'm going to say that one more time. Equity occurs when a person or group's identity or diversity characteristics cannot determine or predict an outcome. And so I'm going to leave it right here, right now, and I'm going to let some of my colleagues here provide their information.
Derry, thanks for that. I think this is a good segue into my box story. I want to share with you my experience in my box, going with Derry's analogy. The box I was in, an apprenticeship program. It wasn't in the water industry, but it was an apprenticeship program. It was an electromechanical apprenticeship program, was the box. And the selection process was great. It was a tremendous amount of candidates who tried to apply. They let 12 of us into the program. I was one of the 12 that made it in. During my time, this apprenticeship took 8,000 hours to complete, a little over 4 years, depending upon how fast we went. But during the course of the program, we were taking classes at community colleges, and it came about that we had a class that we all thought was the toughest class that we had thus far. And it was a physics class. And so we were going through this class, and we all was struggling, and we were trying to work together, some more than others, to try to figure things out. And so we had a midterm. And we left the midterm thinking, everybody shaking their head like that was tough. That was a tough test. It was tough. And so the next week when we returned to class and we got with the teacher, and the teacher gave us the results of the midterm, and we were all on pins and needles because we felt like it really challenged us. And so he let us know that out of the 12 of us, only 2 of us had gotten an A. And right away, we start looking around the room. People start wondering, well, who got an A? Who got an A? Who got an A? And so there was a buzz. You can hear a pin drop. You know, it's like, you know, and so, so then the teachers disclosed who had gotten an A. One of them was a white male. He actually was my counterpart, because they separated us in pairs as apprentices to rotate to the different departments to learn our on-the-job training. And he had gotten an A. And then he announced the other A, and the A was yours truly. I had gotten an A. And almost immediately, one of my white female co-apprentices said out loud, "Robert got an A?" Note that she didn't say that the other guy got an A. She wasn't surprised about that. But when he announced that I had gotten an A, she, out of her mouth, verbally in the class, "Robert got an A?" I don't know if I don't think I need to say much more. I'm going to tell you another incident that happened while I was an apprentice. I had another fellow apprentice. He was a white male. 2 years in or so into our program, he pulled me aside. He said, "Robert, I'd like to talk to you." And we went outside and we talked, and he shared with me. He said, "I want to share my heart with you." He says, "You have changed my perspective on Black people." He told me this in confidence. He says, "I used to think that Black people were mean and evil." And he said, "And I used to think the darker their skin was, the more evil and bad they were." He told me this to my face. And he was coming from his heart. I can see him almost crying, telling me this. And I consoled him. I told him, "I appreciate you sharing this with me. And I really do. And I'm glad that, you know, you see things a little bit differently now." And so we had a good conversation. But that had never happened to me before. I had never heard someone tell me such raw feelings and thoughts and beliefs about who I was like that. So it was very impactful. And I want to share one more incident from my apprenticeship. The person who got an A, he and I, as I said, were counterparts. So we rotated pretty much for about 3 years, we rotated together to the different departments. And without any change, when we would go to a new department, he would always get the better task. He would get assigned the better journey people to work with. He would get assigned the better tasks. I would get more of the grunt work kind of stuff. He got better exposure than I got right off the bat. They didn't know who we were. This was our first time getting there. We show up, they see him immediately. You work with him, you go do this, and then you work with him and you go do that. And what I got to do was less of quality, less of lending to development than what he had. So a lot of my learning I got secondhand after he and I would talk, or the same thing with some of my other co-apprentices. So, so this was the box that I had to deal with as an apprentice trying to learn a trade. And so these are the gaps that I had to try to close. Had demonstrated the ability to learn. The physics class was an example of that, even though some were surprised that I got an A. But yet, I'm still in this box. So I want to share that with you. And I want to hand it over to Sonja Stanchina, who's going to talk a little bit more about racial equity.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. I'm swallowing lumps in my throat right now. It's really powerful to hear stories, and it breaks my heart. I'm empathizing with you, and I'm sure I'm not the only one on the workshop that is appreciative of you sharing your personal story, and also shares the outrage. So thank you for that. Thank you also, Derry, for just a wonderful opening. What's interesting, people should know, is that we did have one preparation session, but we didn't compare our content material, and it's amazing how well it aligns. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So trying to provide data and statistics on racial equity in 10 minutes is like trying to explain the theory of quantum physics in as much time. We just learned that Robert could do it, though, because he passed that physics class. So I'm sure you'll understand this is a high-level overview and certainly not comprehensive. With that basis and time taken away, let's start with a common understanding of racial equity in its broad definition. So looking at that first slide after the cover slide, the first bullet point says that racial equity means that all people have the same access to resources and opportunities, plus legal, political, and social power, regardless of their racial identity, which aligns identically to the definition that Derry just provided us. The second bullet point identifies, actually it's the second bullet point that aligns with what Derry shared, and that is the vision of racial equity as the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted, in a statistical sense, how one fares. So we're going to stay on this slide for several minutes. According to the U.S. Water Alliance, race is the most significant predictor of differences in access to safe drinking water worldwide, including here in America. I have to say that again. Race is the most significant predictor of differences in access to safe drinking water. That's almost unbelievable in 2020. How can it be that something so vital as access to safe, life-sustaining, health-promoting water can depend on one's race? That blows my mind, and I hope yours as well. This means that all people worldwide and here in America in the 21st century do not have the same access to Maslow's hierarchy basic need of safe water resources. And as terrible as that is to hear, there's also a wide body of data and other research concluding disparate access based on race to a bunch of other categories that Derry just identified for us: healthcare, education, employment, housing, income and wealth development, the justice system, civic participation, general respect and dignity treatment, and even mortality rates. Yes, I said it, mortality, I know, yikes. So taking a look at the next slide, 2018 CDC infant mortality rates for every 1,000 live births within the first year of life. The high is that 11 Black babies die as compared to the low of 4 Asian babies having died. 4 of the 5 reasons are linked with healthcare. So that's the soil that we just heard about from Derry. The US National Vital Statistics for 2017 mortality rates reported on average that Black Americans live 3.5 years less than white Americans. Just like we don't have time to unpack the safe drinking water gut punch, we don't have time to unpack the contributing factors that comprise the statistic about mortality rates being tied to one's race. Race not only affects the human experience while living, but also in death. So let's now look at statistics about race in the workplace. If anyone wants the sources of these statistics, please email me. After I'm done, I'll put my email address in the chat box. Okay, looking at the next slide, we can see from the American Water Works Association survey that of the 46% of the members who completed the survey, more than 86% of them are white. Contrast that with all of the others who are not even in the double digits or even halfway up to 10%. Moving on to the next slide. We see 2019 racial discrimination statistics. 76% of African Americans and Asian Americans reported experiencing discrimination, 58% of Hispanics, and those 67% of whites who say they have never dealt with discrimination, this statistic tells us that 1 in 3 has, and that's far too much. 1% is too much. A surprising statistic is that racial discrimination in the hiring process for African Americans has not improved in the last 25 years. This means that the rate of new African American hires has remained comparable to that in 1995. This slide also reports the race-based statistics from the federal agency, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the California State Agency, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. And folks, please know, these statistics are 2019. You've got to do better. So why should we all care? And for those of you who feel like you've not been directly affected by racial inequities, why should everyone care about this? I'm glad you asked. So looking at the next slide, the answer is that racial inequities in the workplace negatively affect everyone. We are all a part of one mobile. So that the great and late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, quote, "Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality," end quote. If I directly touch that stuffed bear, all of the other stuffed animals on the mobile are indirectly affected as well. This is what happens in nuclear families when one person is suffering. And it happens, this is what happens in nuclear families, just our regular home families when one person is suffering. And it happens in our work families too. We are all impacted. For every formal race-based complaint, who knows how many employees are silently suffering? These are the employees who are disengaged, they're going through the motions on the job, they're even job searching during paid work time. Some employees are sowing discord on the job, perhaps unintentionally, since they need to talk about their pain. Absenteeism goes up, and a whole lot of other non-productive things happen until the employee leaves or the problem is resolved in some other way. Countless staff resources have to focus on trying to resolve the symptoms of the cause, relationships become damaged, trust erodes, and all kinds of problems arise when employees experience disparate access to resources and opportunities within our organizations. So we've had enough of the bad news, data and statistics. Let's shift our focus now. There's actually some good news statistics to support diversity and racial equity efforts. So looking at our final slide, for agencies who are not actively building more diverse, equitable, and inclusive cultures, there is a significant price to pay for racial inequities because data tells us that it directly affects the whole lot of stuffed animals on that mobile. Revenue and profits increase with a 2.3 times higher cash flow. Diverse management teams boost revenue by nearly 20%. 43% of companies with diverse boards report higher profits, 43%. I realize that we're public agencies, but all the more reason as fiduciaries of taxpayer and ratepayer monies that we be responsible financial stewards. The data also says that racial equity boosts employee performance. Diverse companies are 87% better at making decisions. This is huge. You know, we're all presented with unprecedented challenges today and in the years to come, and more than ever before, we need to make the best decisions. And so we all need diverse teams with diverse perspectives where each team member has the same access to resources and opportunities regardless of race. Another group of statistics to support the business case for diversity and racial equity in the workplace includes attracting and retaining talent. 67% of candidates actually seek out diverse companies. They look for racial equity indicators in the agency branding and other materials. 57% of employees say they believe their companies should improve diversity among the internal workforce. 40% of employees leave after experiencing harassment, bullying, or even just stereotyping. The other benefits are listed on the slide, and in summary, we've heard a lot of statistics evidencing how race affects the human experience in life and death, and also specifically in the workplace. You've also heard statistics which support the benefits of a racially diverse and equitable workplace. So let me close with a final thought. Less than 2 weeks ago, 3 California state employees came into work one morning at their West Sacramento office. 2 Black men found small note cards on their desks, each contained the N-word. A white man with photos of his Black wife and daughter on his desk also found a small note card on his desk with the same type of racist message using the N-word. I cannot imagine how these employees felt then and feel today, probably not knowing which person or persons of their colleagues sees them as the note cards expressed. These employees don't have racial equity in their workplace. They don't have the same access of even being treated with dignity and respect. It's absolutely exhausting and infuriating to learn of these types of events that still seem to happen every single day all across America. To mitigate racial inequity requires contributions from all of us. Before we can galvanize around how to solve a problem, we first must agree the problem exists or that there is opportunity for improvement. So I hope that this segment helped in that area. I commend all of you for investing your precious time to be in this workshop. It proves that you want to be a part of the solution. So thank you. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Robert.
All right. Thanks for sharing that information, Sonja. Thank you so much. Now we want to answer the question, how does racial equity impact environmental justice? And we'll listen to Masood, Ordikhani, and Nguyen.
Hello, thank you so much. So my name is Nguyen and I'm with Valley Water. So I'm the management analyst with our Racial Equity and Diversity and Inclusion Office. And I just wanted to say, again, thank you so much for allowing me to serve on this panel to really share my experience. So I am somewhat new to this field, but I'm learning so much, and everyone has been really generous with not only their time as well as their knowledge. And that's why I really enjoy working in local government, because everyone is really willing to share. And I'm glad to serve on this panel with such dedicated professionals, as everybody has talked about their experience and their work in this field, and even their personal experience as well. And forgive me, so this is my first time also serving on a panel. I was just telling a friend that I wish we were talking about cats, which is much easier for me. But again, thank you so much for allowing me to talk about my experience. And just to give you some kind of background as well. So as I said, I'm somewhat new to utility and water, but I have worked in local government for a few years, working in both public health and social services. And so some of my previous work was working with our most underserved populations. And so I was managing programs for those experiencing homelessness, as well as our farm worker population. And really understanding that, it is really a true privilege to have a voice and to be heard. So I don't take that lightly at all. And when I think about equity and, my work in the healthcare field previous to this, we looked at data of patients and trying to understand the inequalities within the healthcare system, looking at, health disparities, understanding really what the barriers were to good health and good health outcomes. And so, we looked at it in terms of what we consider social determinants of health. And so that's, where you live, where you work, where you play, your education, and even your income level, how that really affects good health outcomes. And, some of my colleagues here on this panel have talked about that, being health outcome driven and having a lot of data to really look at that, to have a better understanding. And then once we look at that, we can really have a more strategic approach when we really cater our services to each individual community, because it is very different. And, what I have learned in working in public health is a lot of the times, we're not here and we're not able to solve everybody's problems, but we really need to engage and be really open and honest about, what's going on. And I think for the most part, it's not really, what you say or, what you ask, because, for the most part, we were collecting so much data that was very sensitive, in healthcare system, but it's really how you talk and engage to people to ensure that, when we're talking to people, we're really being very intentional. And so, that's something that I've learned in the healthcare system, and I'm really trying to take that same approach within water utility as well. And so when I think about racial equity within this field of water utility, I tend to tie it back with environmental justice. And this is also something I'm learning a lot about as well, what environmental justice really means, right? And so, if you look at the federal definition from the 90s, environmental justice is the fair treatment of people regardless of race, color, national origin, income, in regards to environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And so this really comes to, the historical idea that historically, disproportionately, there's communities of color who have really been impacted by, a lot of the activities in regards to water utility, right? Whether or not you're living in an area that's poor and has really bad pollutants and toxins. So that really obviously affects your health. And so, we want to make sure that the work that we do really lessens that, and so is equitable in many ways, whether it is, our policy and planning when we're talking about everything from flood management projects to capital improvement projects to even wastewater treatment facilities. And so, that helps me kind of ground the work that we do and why we're really all here, in terms of really trying to serve our community in the best way that we really can. And so I bring it back to how we really communicate what those problems are, and really being open and honest with the communities that we serve, that, we may not have all the answers to, the issues that have been historically been taking place because of government policies, but that we're here to make sure that they are a part of the process, that we are engaging them. Even looking at this year, so, I come from a family where English proficiency is an issue. And so, a lot of communities, when we think about communication, we really take for granted that we communicate a lot of the work that we do in English. And so there's so much misinformation, just even in the English language alone. So to think about other languages and how they're so bombarded by disinformation, that, we have to be very thoughtful and intentional in how we communicate what we do in the language of the community that we serve, right? Whether that be, through written literature, social media, and really making sure that we are making that extra effort to really engage and make sure that the access of information is truly equitable in the things that we do. And so that's something that I'm always kind of cognizant of, and I really wanted to make sure that was kind of a point that was taken as well, that communication, how important that really is, not only to, to the communities that we serve, but even within the staff that we work with as well. Understanding that, this work of racial equity is really challenging, but at the same time, it's really rewarding as well. And so, when I think about this, I'm constantly talking to staff about, we have issues, but I think that if we're able to really come together and be really collaborative in what we do to engage and educate even the staff about what's going on, because, we can certainly change policies, we can write resolutions, but if there's not a culture change within an organization to make sure that that this is really a priority, and that this work of racial equity is something that we all want to be a part of, that it doesn't live with one person, with one department, but that all of us are really holding each other accountable, and that there is space to kind of learn and grow, that we're not all on, the same levels. And so that's something I'm always constantly thinking about as well. How can we communicate this throughout staff? And even when we think about training, and training is such a general term that we want to make sure that whatever training that is, because we are constrained by budgets and by time, but that we are constantly reinforcing the message, right? So even if it's during your lunch or during breaks after work, that we are engaging with folks about this work and having a safe space for staff to question and to talk about their concerns is something that I'm always constantly thinking about as well. And so I think even a great example of working with the community, recently back in just October, we worked with NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And, we worked on this amazing 2-day event, really kind of covering sea level rise as well as flood management. And it was a way for us to ensure that communities of color felt empowered in the policies that really impacted them. And so I just want to leave it right there, and also talk about really how much I look forward to continuing this work to serve the community. And I'm always really inspired by not only the people that I work with, but also the communities as well, to really make sure that, we are doing the best work that we can. And all these stories are so amazing that everybody's bringing up. And I just want to make sure, that we are being thoughtful as well as intentional in the work that we do in this, including the amazing work that my colleague Masood from SFPUC will be talking about as well. So again, thank you so much for allowing me to share.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for that great ground setting and setting the table around environmental justice. I really appreciate it. I also just want to thank Robert and everyone from BAYWORK for the incredible work you all did convening this, Steve, everyone else, and then my dear friend and colleague, Catherine Curtis, for inviting me and having me join this conversation. I learned so much listening from your presentations. Derry, Robert, your personal story touched my heart. And Sonja, I'm always so moved every time I hear you. I feel like I get another master's degree every time I sit with you. So thank you, sister. And it's funny because Linda, really addressed it. For me, these issues of just environmental justice by itself is its own universe and 10-hour conversation, and then racial equity is its own. So trying to put that into an intersectionality, I think, is a daunting task, but I'll try to kind of meander humbly for you through it. Echoing what Linda said, and how she defined environmental justice. At our agency in 2009, we adopted an environmental justice policy that defined EJ as no one group bearing the disproportionate consequences of our operations, programs, and policies. And then when we went to operationalize it, we then developed a community benefits policy. And in July, we also passed a racial equity, racial justice policy that implemented this. What did it really look like? So for me, over that past decade, it's really been grounded in the precautionary principle of trying to not do any harm and trying to think about who are the communities that would have the potential worst impacts, severe impacts from our operations and focus, and then who could stand to benefit the most if we were to be hyper-intentional in mitigating those impacts and being positive. The other part to me, and Linda alluded to this, and I really appreciated the language access reference she made, because some of it is then who gets access to really actually participate and have decision-making in these folks. So for me and for our agency, a big part of it is who has actual voice on decision-making, who in the communities, who in our own agencies, how are they empowered? How do we arm them with the information, and how do we put things on level playing field? So how do we put decisions associated to the environment on similar playing field with issues like cost, with issues like social barriers, and doing a true analysis and allowing folks to have voice and having community-led processes that folks can engage. So I'll try to talk a little bit about what we've tried to do both internally and externally versus that, because I think that's how we really view it. And then sort of as a utility unique to our industry, maybe give some examples. But as I go through, I want to be a little bit transparent and honest, because in these really hard, complex conversations around racial equity, there are some real constraints over our work. And just like there's some opportunities, and I'll give examples of some of the great stuff we do, I hope to pepper in some of the challenges that I think. What I would love is that I hope we have an opportunity to have some deep, meaningful conversation with each other around, and that it will invite you in to have some conversation about some of these constraints that we can discuss. So when I talk about the internal component of it, I always find it comical that we go out and talk about what we're gonna do in community, or that what we're gonna do in other people's houses before the furniture in our own house is arranged and we perfected what we're gonna do. So right now, without going into a lot of detail around it, we are engaging in a citywide effort where our city passed a law last year that mandates that we have a multi-phased approach about racial equity and doing a complete reset about who gets centered, what work we do, who we are as a city, and then how we are as both service providers and as a city. The first phase of this focuses almost internally all on what we are doing as city agencies. So for us, we're looking at our own issues of pipeline issues, retention, and then a big, big issue that's happened for us, especially around people of color and folks that have been around the agency for a long time, is promotions and promotive opportunities. What does leadership look like? What does our commission that makes decision-making and governance look like? And the importance of representation. Are we making disproportionate decisions around discipline? Do folks get disproportionately impacted by particular individuals? Are there opportunities to invest in those folks? So I wanted to set that frame so that if you want to talk about that in-house part, I think there's like an entire conversation to be had just on that and what utilities can and need to do to make fundamental change. But I wanted to give some concrete examples in the immediacy of now. So some of when I say who makes decision, who has decision-making authority and who participates, one of the examples I wanted to share with you is, as part of our equity work, we were looking at our COVID response and what had to happen overnight to us. As these decisions were made and we all had to go home immediately, many of our colleagues didn't actually get to go home. Many of them still have to show up and have to be frontline workers and have to put their lives on the line. So I get clean drinking water so that when I flush the toilet, it magically disappears. So that the 100% renewable power that comes to my house magically when I turn on the light, I don't have to think about it. And guess what? Almost all of those folks are Black and brown people. And the lower you go in our classifications and the further you go in the hierarchy of whose body, physical life is on the line, the more it is women and men of color, and they are the least paid folks in our agency. So then we think about, okay, now that we're doing this and we're doing a meeting like this, BAYWORK is convening this meeting. How would my colleagues that are right now in wastewater working at our Southeast plant participate in this? Do they even have the laptops? Do they even have the means to have the software in their homes to do this? So that caused us, without going into a lot of, to be really agile to start this tech lending library where we got to everybody a laptop, a phone, access so that they can meaningfully participate. We started thinking about true PPEs and safety in a real meaningful way. And this is what I will say to end this part. And again, if this is what you'd like to talk about, I'm happy to go down this line. But what we were really thinking about is, how do we now recenter those frontline workers and disproportionately reallocate our resources to them? If I get just as many masks as someone that is going to work on the front line and is with less than 6 feet away from each other, it is inequitable. They should be getting much more resources. I already have a laptop. I already have safety in my home. I don't go anywhere, so I'm fine. How could it be equitably distributed? And I think that's some of the conversation we have to have. As we think about some of those issues, though, as we think about who can come to the agency, who has voice, how do we have promotive paths, how do we retain the folks that we have, how do we develop them? There are a lot of constraints. And when I said constraints, I'll put these on the table. And if you all want to talk about them, I would love to talk more about it later. But we are, at least in San Francisco, in a civil service environment where we have so many constraints around what we're able to do. We have barriers that are themselves structurally biased and exclude a lot of people. And then they serve to benefit a certain part of the population. So I will just say, in this lens, when I say there's constraints, without going deep into that, there are those constraints. There are other constraints that are just things like organizational experiential challenges. A lot of my colleagues come to this work and these conversations from very different starting off points and viewpoints. Some of my colleagues feel deeply threatened by the fact that we even talk about racial equity. They look at racial equity as saying, you as a majority Caucasian or Asian employee is no good, or you're gonna get leapfrogged by this boogie monster indigenous person or Black person or Masood that's gonna come take your job. How do we bring those colleagues into these conversations? How do we invite them to see that they mutually benefit from this? How do we ensure also that those majority populations don't dominate and push that supremacy onto our Black, indigenous, people of color populations that these conversations are actually intended to center? And then what do we do around the understandable mistrust of my colleagues that earlier today I sat with all of my Black colleagues at PUC who were like, Sood, I love you, we're gonna try to do it, but I've seen this dance and I think our colleagues are just holding their breath for the racial equity moment to be done. Nothing's gonna happen. And I have so much fear of retaliation, Sood. Please help me. If I say this, make sure I don't get taken care of. And then they tell horror stories of what's happened to them. So what do our systems of accountability look like? How do we meaningfully measure and evaluate this stuff? Sonja's important presentation. How do we evaluate feelings of true inclusion and belonging? So that's some of, I hope, is a little thought-provoking, and we can talk about those. On the external part of it, we have a lot of other deep responsibilities. So for example, for us in Northern California, we're the largest landowner in Northern California. And because some of the initial complicities, especially related to Native populations and indigenous populations, happened around land, we've taken on a complete revisiting of our land use policies. So for example, what are secondary uses of our land and expansive rights? What are our rights around leases, and who do we have leases with, and who do they benefit? Do they benefit golf courses, and who golfs? Or can we partner with indigenous populations who have first right to these lands, and what does those things look like? When we think about environmental impacts, like things like flooding, we're looking at claims. When we're looking at the folks who are in arrears on our bills right now, or we're facing shutoffs before we adopted policies to make those nil, who really gets access to clean, safe drinking water? as a human right, as a fundamental right. So I would say we're really heavily right now looking at affordability and shutoffs as an industry. Maybe we can have some conversations together collectively how we can address this issue while we're in a structural challenge of significant budget constraints. Or I want to put another constraint on the table, Proposition 218. So again, as we think about it, those are some of what we're doing externally, and then these are some of the constraints around that. And where we are being creative, you're being creative, and I've learned a lot from you. Can we mirror and scale up those things and learn from each other? Another area I'm deeply involved in that tries to intersect this EJ component with racial equity is around our contracting equity. So I used to do around $10 billion of capital investments in our communities for critical capital investments. So there are challenges. So in this area, we had Proposition 209 and other things as challenges, but there have been very, very innovative contracting means that we've done to make sure communities of color, local populations that bear the burden of airborne pollution, higher rates of asthma, higher rates of breast cancer by being around my facilities can participate. How do local businesses participate? How do local workers participate? And we did a deep value supply chain analysis that if you're interested in, we can partner in and discuss, that says beyond our contracting, if I bring on a local contractor, they have to go eat food somewhere. They have to buy their supplies somewhere. They have to warehouse somewhere. How can we make sure we scale those opportunities so our community benefits? Those are some of it. At the end of it, what I think the responsibility for us, though, is to be really, really sustainable in this work. So one of the fundamental things I believe in is that because of the travesties that have happened that touched a lot of us show up in a lot of trauma. I actually, honestly, right now, don't even feel very equipped to do this work because of a lot of personal trauma that I'm living. But as people of color, we're asked to take this on even right now. And we're asked to step into this. So because of the death and pain that I have felt immediately around me, I feel an immediate responsiveness to have to be responsive to the Black and brown pain that I see around me. But then I feel like a deeper commitment to make sure this is a long conversation and long game. It took 400 years for folks to perfect the game around racism and structural and institutional biases that are here. And what I really believe in is we have to commit to deep organizational and cultural change. And what does that really look like? The hope I have around that is that it took human beings. It took human beings to be really imaginative and creative to devise these beautiful, brilliant structures that are oppressive, that are discriminatory. So what it will take is us to be equally imaginative, equally creative, and ask those folks to step in for these moral sins that we have collectively caused, for what we have done and the travesty that we've caused. Now we have that responsibility to pay for those moral sins with how we're going to come in and resolve these issues and address these issues and pay for the complicity we have contributed to. So I hope that's what I would love to invite and be a part of to contribute to you so that we can be imaginative to create the different paradigm for all of our folks to really equally participate. So thank you with that, Robert. I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Masood and Linda. Really, really appreciate your perspective and sharing this great information. Now we want to further answer the question, how are some agencies addressing racial equity? And for that, we'll turn it over to Stephanie Orosco and Ryan Pedrotti.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. So my colleague and I are going to be sharing with you two ends of the spectrum in terms of where we are as organizations with our diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. It is very much early days for us at San Jose Water Company. Certainly diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't a new conversation for our organization. You know, as Derry mentioned earlier, over the years, we've reviewed the usual AAP and EEO metrics. You know, how many females and minorities do we have in leadership roles? Is our compensation equitable? Are people being developed, you know, equitably across the organization for opportunities? And to that end, you know, we provide education and training, as many organizations do, on unlawful discrimination, respect, and valuing diversity in the workplace. Where we are right now is we're taking diversity, equity, and inclusion to a position of prominence in the organization. It's no longer the kind of special thing we do if there's enough time after we get to our other, you know, major projects for the year. And we really began this current effort with a town hall meeting in June that followed the nationwide protests on the heels of George Floyd's death. And our purpose for gathering our employees was critically important and really historic. We had never done anything like this before. We knew our colleagues were hurting, and we wanted to bring folks together and encourage some story sharing and some healing as a group. And we wanted to really understand how we, as a team, could better support all of our employees, combat racism, and make our organization a force for positive change in our communities. And so, you know, our belief is that a critical first step in the journey is just to listen, you know, to listen to our colleagues and learn from their life experiences. And to that end, our leadership team invited a group of Black employees to come and meet with them, you know, purely voluntary, you know, and just kind of share, you know, what their reactions were to what was happening and to share their stories and their experiences. And it was very powerful. And that group then was asked, how would you feel about sharing this broader in the organization, you know, with your colleagues? And they were more than eager to do that. And I have to tell you, it was incredibly courageous of these folks to share some of the stories that they did. There were, you could see in the Zoom call, you know, a lot of this going on with folks, and, you know, because really, really powerful and hard to hear stories that they were brave enough to share. And so as an outcome of that, we brought a group of employees together from across the organization to form a diversity, equity, and inclusion council. And what's really important to us about this whole thing, as Masood was just saying, is that it needs to be sustainable. We don't want this to be, you know, another initiative, or, you know, I think we've all seen programs, you know, come and go over the years and not really get the steam and be continued on and move forward. So it's absolutely front and center. And, you know, as an organization, we're measuring ourselves through our compensation programs and our incentives going forward. And we're incorporating everything, you know, that we're talking about in this Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Council into our work projects, our values as an organization. And so, as I mentioned, we really are in the early days of program development. We're coming up with, you know, what can make sense for our employees and our culture. So we're doing a lot of listening right now with our DEIC Council to get certain elements in place. So, you know, first of all is education, right? We're starting with stories and experiences outside of work, inside of work. And our philosophy is that we really want to get the buy-in and the support and build it within our culture, not go out and benchmark and replicate, you know, what other organizations are doing. It has to be a fit for us, and something that our employees who have joined this council say, yes, we think this is the way forward, and we'll continue to evolve that over time. We really want the council to build this program, to own it, and to grow it. And, you know, really, one of the things that, you know, we took into account is, you know, previously in our organization, you know, I think up until 2 years ago, we didn't have, you know, a core set of values as an organization. We, you know, we really didn't talk about a lot of the things that we do now. And it's really been an evolution in leadership, and it's given our employees in turn a voice and the sense that it's okay to have these conversations now and to raise these issues. And you know, it's not comfortable for everyone. It's not easy, but it's good conversation. It needs to be had. And we're getting to a much better place, but we've got a lot of work ahead of us. And we know, you know, I think is one of our speakers were saying about the 3 employees in Sacramento who came into those notes. We know in every organization that there are those individuals there who are resistant, who don't believe in it. And that they could be right there at the table with us at times. And we're going to, do everything we can, to try to reach them through education and through these programs. But we do find from our employees that really the most powerful way is through those connections. And we think by other employees hearing their colleagues' stories, and these are people that they work with every day and have respect for, that we're going to be able to break down, some of those barriers over time. So that is the story of where we are as an organization right now. And with that, I'd like to transition it over to Ryan and let him share.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. Can you all hear me okay? Excellent. So I'll try to be brief so we have at least a full 15 minutes for questions and answers. So the perspective I'm hoping to provide is a couple things. One is how to create space for racial equity work in your day-to-day work. And two is taking these large institutional and structural concepts and applying it to your everyday work. And I'm going to kind of explain my path in helping to embed that work in Sonoma Water, the organization that I work for. So I have a fairly unique position. I manage a public education, an education and public outreach team. So my background is actually as a teacher. And so I came to this work by working in schools and recognizing the inherent inequities. So if you have any association with schools, you understand how racial and societal inequities are very transparent in how our school systems are funded and how educational outcomes are disparate. And so we don't have an Office of Equity at Sonoma Water, our organization. And so my role in moving into this work was through the Racial Equity Alliance. So Linda put the link in the chat, and I really suggest you check it out. So I went through a year-long training process through GARE, Government Alliance for Race and Equity. And so what this training process did was a few things. One is it centers race and it introduces a toolkit. And so it centers race, introduces a toolkit, and it normalizes conversation. And so what that does is it allows an opportunity to, one, clearly articulate how intentional and unintentional government policies have led to inequitable outcomes. So what this is specifically talking about is how government has led to inequities. And so that's a really important centering foundational discussion to have for all of us who work for government organizations. And then what this training provides are toolkits, specific opportunities to tweak the lens that we look at our day-to-day bureaucratic jobs with, to think about how our organization is perpetuating inequities. So a really good example is a budget equity toolkit. I'm sure Sonoma Water is a special district that is part of the county of Sonoma. So we have most of our budget pots, I'm sure it's similar for you all, are dedicated to wastewater or water supply. But we also have a general fund that has quite a bit of discretion associated with it. So anytime there is discretion and you have decision makers, there can be the lens of the decision makers dictates the outcome of that money being spent. So it's taking that lens that we all have and trying to add on an equity component to it. I look at this similar to climate. We should all be working through our regular jobs with a climate lens, and we should be doing the same thing with a racial equity lens. And just to kind of bring this home, so after there were 12 county departments that I participate in that went through this training, we came back, and our way to cement it within our organization was to form an internal departmental work group. And what we did was we actually wrote out a strategic plan for what our work group would accomplish. And fortunately, our county was going through its 5-year strategic plan, and we had intentional strategic conversations with key leadership in terms of why adding a racial equity strategic pillar was essential. This conversation happened in December and January of last year. And so as the organization, the county organization, is considering whether or not to adopt a racial equity pillar, there were some external societal factors that happened. COVID, creating inequitable outcomes in our organization, and the racial equity unrest that we've seen take place. And so what we did was we kind of primed the pump so that when external factors made it clear that racial equity needed to be a pillar, we were poised and ready to go. And the first action that took place from that was the creation of an Office of Equity at our county. And so it's kind of being, the only advice I would give is for those of you who are not necessarily affiliated with an Office of Equity or a diversity inclusion group, is that you can carve out space in your time. I would also advocate for my white colleagues to take on this burden so our friends of color don't have to have on the added burden of moving this work forward, because that is really an important lens to keep in mind as we move this through. And I'm at the time that I wanted to go through. So I can plug some more resources in the chat, and I'm really excited to hear some questions.
That was wonderful, Ryan and Stephanie. We so appreciate your comments, sharing your experience, giving perspective. This has been very, very enlightening. So at this time, we want to open it up to those of you in the audience, or even some of our panelists, to have some deeper discussion with the time we have remaining about this so important topic. So you can type your questions in the chat, or if you can give them briefly, you can just sound out. But we do want to make sure we give enough people time to comment as possible.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, it's Levi Fuller, Dublin San Ramon Services District. So I guess I'll preface my thought by saying this. Over the years, I've seen 4 or 5 surveys from Ivy League graduates where they've asked Ivy League graduates, what's the #1 advantage of attending an Ivy League school? And in none of the surveys have I seen has the answer been that the person felt they got a better education than the person who attended the state university. All of those surveys say the #1 advantage of attending a Ivy League school is becoming a part of the social network, an elite social network that can help your career, get jobs, and things of that nature. And so as someone who has been in this industry for, over 30 years, I've sat on probably over 100 interview panels. And I've seen bias that has not necessarily, in some cases, been racially motivated, but it's been relationship bias. And of course, minorities don't get to be a part of that network. And so, #1, not being a part of that network, as Robert's stories, the people in positions to hire have that racial bias. Or, so I guess what I've wondered is that how can we get more minority people to be a part of the social network? So #1, we can eliminate relationship bias at best, or maybe even have minorities benefit from relationship bias, if you understand what I'm saying. So that's, I guess, just my comment.
Great comment and question. Any one of our panelists, let's get one of our panelists to respond to that, whoever so chooses.
Sure. In June, our board of directors created a resolution that asked us to address issues of racial equity and justice. And when we created that, we subsequently then went back to the board and asked them to help us define what they wanted as outcomes. And one of the things that they did mention was us looking at ways in some of our selection processes to make sure that we were looking beyond just paper qualifications, which gets down to what you're talking about, Levi. How can we be better at identifying talent and not just the legacy of institutions, and just buying into that, as opposed to really specifically looking at people's qualifications and making sure that we're actually identifying able individuals. And that is such a huge issue. And it's huge for a few different reasons. As you mentioned, it's not only a fact of whether a person earned a college degree, but as you said, is the degree of the right pedigree. And with us, organizationally kind of sitting, having UC Berkeley right in our backyard here, we have to recognize the fact that we do have a bit of a bias factor toward Berkeley grads. When Cal State Hayward also has a civil engineering program, and do we look at those graduates from Cal State Hayward the same way we look at UC grads? And so it's not even just the Ivy League issues; it's some of our local biases, and what do those say and what do those speak about us? And so it is an ongoing thing. And again, it gets back to the necessity of us being able to first identify the biases that we have them, and then secondarily, once they're identified, how do we start to mediate that? How do we start to look at ways to eliminate some of that systemic issue and systemic and cultural issue out of what we do. So
That's great. Great sharing that, Derry.
Yeah, I just want to share This American Life and Serial had a great podcast called Nice White Parents, which just is a 5-hour dive into this exact topic of unintentional consequences of supporting your own in-group. So it's really, inequitable policies can be hard to identify is kind of the summary of that.
That's great, Ryan. Any other questions, thoughts, or comments? I'm going to take the silence as if you are.
I got something for you, Robert.
Okay.
Or for the panelists, I guess. A lot of amazing work and groundbreaking work happening at individual agencies. And I know there's some conversations happening at an industry level across the state. I'm wondering if our panelists can discuss what's the opportunity at the regional industry level for us to coordinate or collaborate on this. I know, Masood, you spoke to a little bit, but where do we start? How do we get that started?
Man, I'm probably the worst person to talk about that because I have a relatively cynical view about that, but maybe that's important. Maybe that's important to share. So we're doing a lot of really good work, I think, statewide on a KUA panel that I think is focused on diversity that I have a little bit of hope in because some of the folks that are on the panel here are on that, and then some of the leadership on that, like Rick Carpenter from Santa Clara Valley Water District, Michael Carlin from our organization are there. So that gives me some hope. I think there's some national conversations on Voila and those folks that are doing a little bit of work around thinking through issues of affordability, those kind of issues. But Steve, I almost feel like in the same way we were saying, if we can parse internally in-house what it looks like, if we can be concrete and say, identify exactly what one or two issues that are uniform to us. Like we all know we're going to have in this upcoming next 10, 20 years, a massive, the word's leaving me, but folks leaving our agencies that have came during the Clean Water Act. While we do that, there's a massive opportunity to bring folks in. We've talked about this for a long time. What's that really gonna look like and which component are we gonna talk about? So to Levi's question earlier, if we had pipeline programs with non-traditional places where it was like schools and pipelines and reentry programs and trade schools, if we gave people on-the-job training with Black and brown populations, if we went into the jails, if we were working with schools, if we actually had formal mentorships with folks that are in the industry like Levi and the next Levi's that are gonna come, would those address it? If we set up networking events for that, how are we gonna actually build out some of the biases that are in it? Like, are there actual bias? There's literally trainings for this type of stuff and systems and AI that can do it. And then as an industry, what are the issues externally? So like we know a lot of our folks because of COVID and unemployment are gonna struggle to pay their bills right now. How can we come together collectively to think about the lobbying we need to do as a mass to get the type of resourcing we need to buttress those resources to hold our communities up? When we think about the environmental and impacts that we have in these communities, how do we think about the smaller utilities that aren't San Francisco and have the leverage and privileges of excess that we have and the disproportionate burdens that we have? And then what resources can we think about regionally? Like my workers can become your workers live in our, how can we think collectively about how we take these issues on? If we come up with land use policies or legal language that's taken and thinks about, for example, how workers can come on from local communities and work on these projects, can you all just take those and plug and play them in your infrastructure projects where you may not have the capacity to have a large LBE or local hire organization? So those are just some thoughts about some things we can do.
One more thing. Yeah, one more thing to add to all of that is that we all have to do a better job with increasing awareness of who we are and getting down to the grassroots efforts of going out into our communities, developing these community partnerships, local education associations and community associations, so that people are aware that we have jobs in the water industry. Not everybody fits the Ivy League school or even a 4-year college degree. And we have treatment plant operator and distribution operator positions. They don't require a college degree, and they're very well compensated with benefits. And there's a ton of other engineering and instrumentation types of positions. So we all have to do a better job getting the word out so that our candidates are aware at a very early age that these are career options for them.
Wonderful. I want to applaud all the panelists. Excellent job. This was an opportunity for BAYWORK to kick off our effort to, with our racial diversity equality working group that we are establishing. And so if you're here in attendance and you're interested in working more with BAYWORK on these issues, give us ping us. You can contact any of BAYWORK staff. You can look at our website, find our emails, and contact us that way. If you're interested in being part of our working group, this serves, as I said, a kickoff to that. And we got a lot of questions that came up, a lot of ideas, a lot of concepts that we plan to address collectively. The goal of the working group is to do what we did today, is to talk, is to share what we're doing and come up with ideas and solutions that we can take back to our agencies and implement, and how we can affect. And I don't know what it's going to become. It could become even something bigger than that. But that's the initial goal, is that we will collaborate, that we would share, and that we would strengthen each other in our individual efforts to move this needle in our organizations. And so this has been excellent. I appreciate everybody's comments and participation. This has been really, really good. So look forward to hearing more from us. We thank you for being with us today. We want to encourage you to check our website, because we will be posting the recording of this session, as well as any other information that we want to share regarding this issue. And we're going to move this needle forward. And as everyone said, that we got a lot. It's a lot to do. It's a big playing field, but we got to get into the game if we want to make a move and make a score. So I appreciate everyone's attendance today, and thank you for all your participation. I am on fire, if you can't tell already, but and it's extremely excited for what the future holds for us. And I do want to say this to you, though. We are starting out with a reasonable goal. I can see it morphing into something even bigger and greater than what we even have in our minds right now. And as Masood said so eloquently, it took them 400 years to establish this structure of this inequitable program and system. So it's going to take a lot of work for us to undo it. And anybody who's willing to get on board with this, we're willing to have you. So thanks again, everybody, for being here. And we look forward to hearing and seeing you in the near future.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Yes, thank you.
Thank you to all of our presenters, to all of our participants. This is the issue of our time. this and climate change. And if we don't do something, who will? So join us, please. Let's march forward together and enhance the power that we all collectively can share to make changes that are sustainable and that are equitable for all. Thank
All right, Catherine. Amen.
All right.
All right,
Take
thank
care,
you.
everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.